Vera Collins woke before dawn, as she had every morning for most of her adult life. The sky over rural Iowa was still dark, the air cool and damp. When she pulled on her worn jacket and stepped outside, the farm was quiet except for the low, familiar sounds coming from the barn. Cows shifted in their stalls, hooves scraping softly against the concrete floor, waiting for her the way they always did. She moved through her routine without thinking. Years of repetition had turned every motion into muscle memory. Buckets were carried, equipment checked, hands working steadily despite the ache that never fully left her wrists or shoulders. By the time the sun began to rise, a pale line of light spreading across the fields, Vera's back was already stiff with fatigue. She ignored it as she always did. There was still too much to do. After the morning milking, she returned to the house. The small farmhouse smelled faintly of hay, soap, and last night's cooking. Vera set water to boil, wiped down the kitchen table, and began preparing food almost automatically. She moved from room to room, cleaning as she went, sweeping floors, straightening chairs, folding laundry that had dried overnight. Each task was simple on its own, but together they weighed on her body. By late morning, sweat dampened her hairline, and her legs felt heavy. It was while she was rolling dough on the kitchen counter that the phone rang. Vera wiped her hands on a towel and picked it up, already guessing who it was. She recognized her daughter's voice immediately, bright and excited in a way that made Vera's chest tighten with affection. Emily was coming home. Not alone, either. She was bringing her fiancé with her. Vera listened carefully as Emily spoke, describing plans, timing, and how long they would stay. And then came the detail that made Vera pause, her fingers tightening around the receiver. His family was wealthy, influential, city people. Emily tried to sound casual, but Vera heard the significance beneath the words. Her daughter had met someone from a very different world. Someone whose parents moved in circles Vera had never even seen, let alone belonged to. When the call ended, Vera stood there for a moment, the quiet of the kitchen closing in around her. Pride came first, a deep, aching pride that filled her chest. Emily had grown up without a father, raised on the same farm, watching her mother work herself to exhaustion day after day. And yet she had made it to the city. She had studied, worked, and built a life strong enough to stand on its own. Now she was engaged, loved, chosen. But pride was quickly followed by something heavier. Vera looked down at her hands. They were rough, the skin thickened and cracked from years of physical labor. Her clothes were simple, practical, chosen for work rather than appearance. She imagined city people, polished and confident, sitting across from her at a table, noticing everything she tried to hide. She thought about how her house looked, about the smell of the farm that never fully went away, about how easily she might say the wrong thing or the wrong thing, reveal herself as someone who did not belong. Emily had said his family was kind, respectable, successful. Vera believed her daughter, but belief did not quiet the worry rising inside her. She knew how people could be when they thought they were better than someone else. She had seen it before in small ways, even here. A glance, a tone, a pause that said everything without words. As the day went on, Vera worked harder than usual. She cleaned more thoroughly, cooked more carefully, as if effort alone could prepare her for what was coming. Yet beneath every task ran the same uneasy thought. Would she be enough? By evening, her body ached, and her mind refused to rest. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring out the window at the darkening fields. She loved her daughter fiercely. For Emily's happiness, she would endure any discomfort, any judgment. Still, the imbalance was there, pressing quietly against her thoughts. Rural and urban, poor and wealthy, mother and future in-laws she had never met. Vera took a slow breath and folded her hands together. Whatever awaited her, she would face it, not for herself, but for her daughter. Emily arrived in the late afternoon, the car pulling into the gravel drive, just as the sun dipped low over the fields. Vera watched from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart lifting at the sight of her daughter stepping out first. Emily looked thinner than Vera remembered, more confident somehow, her posture straight, her smile easy and unguarded. Then the young man emerged from the driver's side. Andrew Parker was taller than Vera had imagined, neatly dressed but not flashy. He moved with an ease that suggested comfort in unfamiliar places. Yet there was no trace of impatience or condescension in the way he approached the house. When Vera stepped forward, he smiled and extended his hand without hesitation. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice calm and respectful. "Thank you for welcoming me." The words were simple, but the sincerity in them surprised her. Vera nodded, suddenly aware of the tension she had been carrying all day. She ushered them inside, apologizing out of habit for the smallness of the house, the narrow hallway, the faint smell of the farm that clung to everything. Andrew didn't seem to notice. He took off his shoes at the door without being asked and looked around with open curiosity. When Vera set plates on the table and brought out the food she had prepared, he thanked her again, genuinely, before taking his first bite. "This is incredible," he said after a moment. "I can't remember the last time I ate something that tasted this real." Vera laughed softly, unsure how to respond. She watched him as he spoke to Emily, how he leaned in slightly when she talked, how his eyes followed her with quiet attention. Emily, for her part, seemed to glow. There was a lightness to her that Vera hadn't seen in years. She spoke easily, confidently, as if the future no longer felt uncertain. For the first time since the phone call days earlier, Vera allowed herself to relax. Perhaps she had worried too much. Perhaps this young man truly cared for her daughter, not as a novelty or a conquest, but as an equal. They talked about the farm, about the city, about Andrew's work and Emily's studies. Andrew listened more than he spoke, asking questions without judgment. When Vera mentioned how hard Emily had worked to get where she was, he nodded, his expression serious. "She never complains," he said. "That's one of the things I admire most about her." The conversation drifted naturally until Emily glanced at Andrew, then at her mother, her tone shifting slightly. "Mom," she said, hesitating just enough for Vera to notice. "There's something we wanted to talk to you about." Andrew straightened in his chair. "My parents would like to meet you," he said carefully. "They believe it's important. A proper introduction." Vera felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but she kept her face neutral. "They've invited you to dinner," Emily added quickly. "In Des Moines, at a restaurant they like." The words settled heavily in the room. Vera opened her mouth to ask when all of them would go together, but Andrew spoke again, gently. "They asked for it to be just you," he said. "A private dinner. They thought it would be appropriate." Vera's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of sitting alone in an upscale restaurant, surrounded by people who lived a life she barely understood, made her stomach turn. She glanced at Emily, ready to suggest a simpler meeting, something at home, something safer. But Emily was watching her closely, hope written plainly across her face. "It would mean a lot to me," Emily said softly. Vera looked from her daughter to Andrew, then back again. The warmth Andrew had shown, the happiness in Emily's eyes, steadied her. She forced a small smile and nodded. "All right," she said. "I'll go." Emily exhaled in relief, reaching for her hand. Vera squeezed it back, even as a quiet unease settled deep inside her. Emily's childhood had been shaped by absence as much as by presence. Her father died when she was still very young. Too young to remember his voice or the weight of his hand on her shoulder. What remained of him lived only in a faded photograph on the wall and in the quiet way Vera sometimes paused when his name surfaced in conversation. From that moment on, the farm became both home and burden, and Vera became everything at once, mother, provider, and shield against a world that offered little mercy. Vera worked harder after her husband's death, not because she wanted to, but because there was no other choice. The dairy farm demanded constancy. Cows needed milking whether she was tired or sick, grieving or hopeful. Winters were long and unforgiving, summers relentless. Money was always tight. Vera learned to stretch meals, mend clothes instead of replacing them, and put her own needs last without complaint. New shoes for Emily mattered more than warmth for herself. School supplies mattered more than rest. Emily noticed these sacrifices even as a child. She learned early not to ask for more than necessary. She studied at the kitchen table while Vera worked late into the night, her mother's exhaustion a silent lesson in responsibility. There were moments when Emily felt guilty for dreaming of anything beyond the farm, but Vera never allowed that guilt to take root. When Emily finished high school, diploma in hand, Vera made a decision that frightened her more than she admitted. She told her daughter to leave. "There's nothing here for you," she said one evening. Her voice steady despite the fear underneath. "You need to see more than this. You're meant for more than this." Vera sold what she could, saved what little she had, and sent Emily to the city with enough money to last a few months. Watching her daughter leave was harder than any physical labor she had ever endured, but she believed it was necessary. Emily belonged somewhere with possibilities. The first setback came sooner than either of them expected. Emily studied hard, but competition was fierce. She missed the cutoff for full-time enrollment by a narrow margin. The rejection felt devastating. Emily sat on the steps outside the university, her composure finally breaking as tears spilled over. She felt she had failed, not just herself, but her mother, who had given everything for this chance. It was there that a university staff member noticed her. The woman listened quietly as Emily explained her situation, her voice trembling with frustration and shame. Instead of turning away, she offered a practical solution. Emily could enroll part-time. It would take longer, but it would still lead to a degree. There was also a position opening in the university library. The pay was modest, but the hours were flexible. Emily accepted without hesitation. Life became a careful balance. Classes in the morning, library shifts in the afternoon, studying late into the night. She lived simply, avoided distractions, and sent reassuring messages home, downplaying how hard things really were. Vera, in turn, worked even longer hours, refusing to let herself worry too much. They supported each other from a distance, bonded by shared endurance. The library became Emily's refuge. It was quiet, orderly, and predictable. Everything her life felt like it lacked. She took pride in her work, shelving books carefully, helping students find what they needed, treating every task with seriousness. Andrew Parker was one of the regulars. At first, he was just another student who came often and stayed late, always carrying stacks of books. He asked thoughtful questions and thanked her every time she helped him. Over time, brief exchanges turned into conversations. They spoke about literature, about classes, about plans for the future. Andrew never asked where Emily came from or what her parents did. He listened without judgment, curious rather than evaluative. Their connection grew slowly. There were no grand gestures, no expensive outings. They walked together after closing hours, shared coffee instead of dinners, talked about ideas rather than appearances. Emily felt seen in a way she never had before, not as someone trying to prove her worth, but as someone who already had it. Andrew admired her discipline and resilience. Emily admired his attentiveness and calm confidence. Their relationship was built on words, understanding, and time, not status or money. Looking back, it was this foundation that mattered most. Long before families, expectations, or judgments entered the picture, what bound them together was simple and genuine. Emily had not been chosen for where she came from, but for who she was. Andrew's parents did not hide their disapproval for long. Margaret Parker learned about Emily gradually. Through fragments Andrew shared and details she extracted with careful questions. A girl from a dairy farm in rural Iowa, a widowed mother, part-time studies, library work. Each fact settled into Margaret's expression like a stain she could not ignore. By the time Andrew finally brought Emily to their home, Margaret had already made up her mind. Richard Parker was more restrained, but no less firm. He listened in silence as Margaret spoke, his disapproval revealed in clipped comments and pointed silences. He spoke of practical concerns, of long-term compatibility, of how love alone did not sustain a household. Margaret was less subtle. "She's ambitious," Margaret said once, folding her arms. "Girls like that always are. They know exactly what they're doing." Andrew stiffened immediately. He had expected questions, even skepticism. He had not expected outright contempt. "She's not using me," he replied, his voice controlled. "Emily works harder than anyone I know. She doesn't ask for anything." Margaret smiled thinly. "That's how it always starts." The tension escalated quickly. Every conversation circled back to the same accusations, dressed up in polite language. Emily was from the wrong background. She lacked polish. She didn't understand their world. Margaret hinted that girls like her saw marriage as an escape route, a way to rise without earning it. Andrew refused to back down. He told them clearly that he loved Emily, that he intended to marry her, that he would rather build a modest life on his own than sacrifice his happiness to satisfy their expectations. The confrontation left the household heavy with unspoken resentment. Richard warned him not to be naive. Margaret warned him, more coldly, not to make a mistake he couldn't undo. Andrew walked out that evening shaken but resolute. Their reaction only strengthened his determination. Margaret, however, did not give up. If anything, her opposition hardened into something sharper. She stopped arguing openly and began planning instead. Margaret suggested a meeting, a proper one, a chance, she said, to understand where Emily came from, to meet her mother. She framed it as courtesy, even generosity. Richard agreed reluctantly, trusting his wife's instincts. Andrew was wary but hopeful. Perhaps, he thought, this was a step toward acceptance. Margaret insisted the meeting take place at a restaurant in Des Moines, not a casual one, but an upscale establishment she frequented often. When Andrew suggested something simpler, she dismissed the idea immediately. "There's no point pretending," she said. "We should meet on equal terms." The phrase sounded reasonable enough, but beneath it lay a quiet calculation. Margaret requested that the dinner be private. Just her, Richard, and Vera Collins. No Emily. No Andrew. She explained it as tradition, as a necessary conversation between families. Andrew hesitated, sensing something off. But Margaret reassured him with practiced ease. "It's just a formality," she said. "If we're going to be connected by marriage, we should speak honestly." In reality, the dinner was never meant to build bridges. It was meant to expose differences, to remind a woman from the countryside where she stood in the social order Margaret believed in. The restaurant was chosen carefully, the setting designed to intimidate without appearing overtly cruel. While Margaret finalized reservations, Vera prepared at home, unaware of the intent behind the invitation. The idea of the restaurant gnawed at her nerves. She asked Linda Harris, her longtime friend, for help. Linda opened her closet without hesitation, pulling out a dress Vera had never worn herself. Shoes followed, a handbag, jewelry that felt too delicate in Vera's hands. "You'll be fine," Linda said, though she could see the worry etched into Vera's face. "Just be yourself." Vera smiled, but her unease deepened. She spent the night before the dinner trying on clothes, studying her reflection, noticing every flaw she believed others would see. Her hands shook as she pinned her hair back, imagining eyes that would measure her worth in silence. She told herself it was for Emily, that any discomfort was temporary. That kindness might still be possible, but somewhere deep inside, Vera felt the imbalance pressing closer, the sense that she was walking into something she did not fully understand. And Margaret Parker waited patiently, certain that the setting she had chosen would speak louder than any words she might say. Vera arrived in Des Moines earlier than planned. The bus dropped her a block away from the restaurant, and she walked the remaining distance slowly, her borrowed shoes clicking against the pavement in a way that felt unfamiliar. The building stood out immediately, tall windows, soft lighting, a polished entrance that seemed to separate those inside from the rest of the city. She paused at the door, smoothing the front of her dress, taking a steadying breath before going in. Inside, the air was warm and perfumed with wine and cooked meat. Voices blended into a low, confident hum. A host approached her at once, professional and brisk. "Reservation?" he asked. "Yes," Vera replied carefully. "Under Parker." The host checked his list, nodded, and gestured for her to follow. Vera's heart beat faster as they moved deeper into the dining room, past tables filled with well-dressed couples and groups who barely glanced her way. She searched the room for familiar faces, Margaret Parker's composed posture, Richard's reserved presence, but saw none. The host stopped at a large table near the center of the room. "This is yours," he said, pulling out a chair. Vera looked down at the table and froze. 6 people were already seated there, 3 men and 3 women, all strangers. Plates were set before them, glasses half full, conversation already underway. They paused and turned toward her with polite curiosity. "I think there's been a mistake," Vera said quickly, her voice thin. "I'm supposed to meet the Parkers." The host glanced at his list again. "This is the Parker reservation," he said. "Everything's been arranged." Before Vera could respond, one of the men at the table smiled and spoke. "You must be Vera Collins," he said. "Please sit. We were told you'd be joining us." Her confusion sharpened into unease. She looked around the table again, hoping someone would explain, correct the misunderstanding, anything. The host gave her a brief nod and stepped away, already moving on to his next task. Vera remained standing, the room seeming to tilt slightly beneath her feet. "I'm sorry," she said, addressing the group. "I was invited to dinner by Margaret Parker." "I don't know." The same man chuckled softly. "Yes, Margaret arranged everything. Wonderful woman. She told us this evening was on you." The words landed slowly, one after another, as if her mind refused to accept them all at once. "On me," Vera repeated. "Yes," the man said easily, lifting his glass. "She said you were hosting. Quite generous, really. We were surprised, but when someone insists, who are we to refuse?" Another woman nodded, smiling. "The food is excellent, and the wine remarkable." Vera felt a sudden rush of heat rise to her face, followed by a cold wave that left her light-headed. Her ears rang faintly. She gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. Hosting, paying. She glanced at the table, at the plates of expensive food, the bottles with labels she didn't recognize but somehow knew she could never afford. Her mind raced through numbers instinctively, her savings, the money in her wallet, the bus fare she needed to get home. It didn't add up, not even close. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said again, more firmly this time. "I can't possibly." The man frowned slightly, then shrugged. "That's what we were told. Margaret was quite clear. She said you wanted to treat us." Margaret Parker's face flashed in Vera's mind, calm and assured, the way she had spoken of tradition and formality. Understanding spread through her chest like a bruise. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, a deliberate one. The room seemed to close in around her. Conversations continued at nearby tables. Laughter rose and fell. Cutlery clinked against porcelain. No one noticed the woman standing frozen beside a table she didn't belong at. Shame followed quickly, sharp and paralyzing. Her cheeks burned. She imagined every pair of eyes suddenly turning toward her, judging her clothes, her posture, her very presence. Panic tightened her throat, making it hard to breathe. She felt dizzy, the edges of her vision blurring for a moment. Sitting suddenly felt safer than standing, as if gravity itself were pushing her down. Vera pulled out the chair and lowered herself into it, her movements stiff and mechanical. If she stood up now and walked away, what would happen? Would they call after her? Would someone stop her? Would the restaurant demand payment, threaten the police? The questions spiraled, each worse than the last. She sat there, hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding. The guests resumed their conversation, assuming the matter settled. Someone offered her wine. She shook her head, barely able to speak. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. Margaret Parker had never intended to meet her. The dinner was never about introductions or respect. It was a lesson, a reminder of who held power and who did not, a way to expose Vera, publicly and painfully, as someone who did not belong in this world. The injustice of it pressed down on her, heavy and inescapable. She had come in good faith, out of love for her daughter. Now she was trapped, seated at a table she could not afford, surrounded by strangers, her dignity quietly dismantled. Vera stared at the white tablecloth in front of her, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing. She had never felt so small, so exposed. And Margaret Parker was nowhere in sight. The tension at the table lingered, thick and suffocating. Vera sat motionless, her hands still folded in her lap, her thoughts racing in tight, panic circles. Someone finally poured her a glass of wine and nudged it gently toward her. She hesitated, then lifted it and took a small sip, hoping it might steady her nerves. The warmth spread quickly through her chest, loosening something inside her that had been clenched for too long. At the far end of the restaurant, a spotlight brightened. A young woman stepped onto the small stage, microphone in hand. She smiled nervously and began to sing. The song was familiar, but the performance faltered almost immediately. Her voice wavered, drifting off-key, missing notes that should have landed cleanly. At first, the audience listened politely. Then chairs shifted. A few people exchanged looks. Someone coughed pointedly. Within moments, the reaction turned unmistakable. Low murmurs rose into open disapproval. A man near the bar shook his head. Another table laughed softly. Someone called out for the music to stop. The singer flushed, her voice growing thinner as she struggled to continue, until finally the noise drowned her out completely. Vera felt the sound hit her like a wave. The unease in her chest tightened, then suddenly broke open. The glass of wine trembled slightly in her hand. Memories stirred, memories she hadn't allowed herself to touch in years. Music lessons she once took. Songs she used to sing quietly to herself after long days of work. A part of her that had been buried beneath exhaustion and survival. Before she fully understood what she was doing, Vera stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor. A few people glanced her way, curious, but she barely noticed. Her feet carried her forward, one step after another, as if guided by something older and stronger than fear. She walked past tables, past startled faces, toward the stage. Someone tried to stop her, murmuring in confusion, but she didn't slow down. Vera climbed the short steps and reached for the microphone. The singer looked at her in shock, then stepped aside without protest. The music faltered, then resumed, softer this time, uncertain. For a brief moment, the room held its breath. Then Vera began to sing. Her first note was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was steady. The second followed, stronger, filled with something the audience hadn't expected. Within seconds, the room changed. Conversation stopped. Cutlery stilled. Heads turned. Her voice carried weight. It wasn't polished or theatrical, but it was real. It held years of longing, regret, endurance, and hope. woven together into something raw and unmistakable. Each note landed exactly where it needed to, resonating through the space like a truth that could no longer be ignored. Vera sang without thinking about the room, without thinking about the table she had left behind. She sang as if she were alone, as if the song were the only way to breathe. Her voice filled the restaurant, pushing back against the humiliation, the fear, the injustice she had felt moments earlier. When she reached the final line, the silence was absolute, and then the applause erupted. It started with a few claps, hesitant at first, then spread rapidly. People stood. Someone whistled. Another shouted praise openly. The applause grew louder, overwhelming, washing over the stage in waves. Vera lowered the microphone, her heart pounding. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything at all. From the edge of the room, a man pushed his way forward. He was tall, well-dressed, his expression stunned in a way that bordered on disbelief. He stared at Vera as if she were a ghost he hadn't known how to mourn. When he reached the stage, he didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, searching her face. "Vera," he said at last, his voice unsteady. The sound of her name, spoken like that, with recognition and something deeper, sent a shock through her. She looked at him properly then. Really looked? And the years fell away in an instant. "Victor," she whispered. Victor Reynolds, the owner of the restaurant, stood before her, his eyes fixed on her as if nothing else in the room existed. The applause faded slowly, confusion rippling through the crowd as they watched the exchange. Victor turned to the audience, lifting a hand. "Thank you," he said firmly. "Thank you all. That will be enough." The room quieted at once. He stepped closer to Vera, his voice dropping. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded faintly, though her legs felt weak beneath her. Victor straightened and looked out across the dining room, his posture shifting from astonishment to authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone calm but unmistakably commanding, "this performance was not scheduled, but it was extraordinary. And tonight's dinner, every table associated with this reservation, is taken care of." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Victor's gaze hardened slightly, completely. He turned back to Vera, offering her his arm. "Please," he said gently, "come with me." As he guided her off the stage, the balance of the room had already shifted. What had been a place of quiet humiliation moments earlier was now something else entirely. And Vera Collins was no longer invisible. Victor did not hesitate. Once Vera was seated away from the stage, he moved with calm efficiency, speaking quietly to staff, gesturing toward the table she had left. His authority was absolute. Within minutes, a manager approached the guests who had been seated there and explained, politely but firmly, that the evening's charges had been settled. No discussion followed. No questions were invited. Victor returned to Vera and knelt slightly so their eyes were level. "You don't owe anyone here a single thing," he said. His voice was steady, unmistakable. "Not an explanation. Not $1. Vera tried to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. The adrenaline of the performance was still fading, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion. She nodded instead, her hands clasped tightly together. Victor stood and addressed the room once more. He did not raise his voice, but the way he spoke carried. "This woman," he said, gesturing toward Vera, "has a voice that comes from lived experience, from honesty, from strength. What you heard tonight was not an accident." There was no drama in his tone. No exaggeration. Just fact. "She is welcome here," he continued, "and she will be treated with the respect she deserves." No one challenged him. A few diners nodded. Others simply watched, absorbing the shift they had just witnessed. Victor turned back to Vera. "I'd like you to work here," he said, "as a singer. Regular evenings. Paid. Properly." The offer landed softly but decisively. Vera stared at him, stunned. A few hours earlier, she had walked into the restaurant expecting judgment. Now she was being offered a place on its stage. "I don't know if I can," she began. "You can," Victor said gently. "And you should." She looked down at her hands again, still rough, still marked by years of labor. The disbelief gave way to something quieter. Gratitude, yes, but also dignity. Not charity, not rescue. An invitation based on merit. "All right," she said at last. Victor smiled, a brief, restrained expression that carried years of unspoken history. "We'll take this one step at a time." That night, Vera returned home late. She called Emily as promised. Her daughter's voice was warm, eager to hear how the dinner had gone. Vera chose her words carefully. "It was fine," she said. "Different, but fine." She did not describe the table of strangers. She did not mention the bill, the panic, the moment her dignity had been tested in public. She spoke instead about meeting people, about the city, about how tired she was. Emily sensed hesitation, but accepted the answer. Vera told herself she was protecting her daughter. There was no reason to burden Emily with cruelty that was already past. Within days, Vera packed a small suitcase and returned to Des Moines. Victor arranged a modest apartment within walking distance of the restaurant. There were no grand gestures, no excess, just practicality and respect. Her first scheduled performance came sooner than she expected. She stood on the same stage, this time under her own name. The room was fuller than usual. Some faces recognized her from the night before. Others came on recommendation alone. When Vera began to sing, the response was immediate. The room quieted. People listened, not out of curiosity but attention. Couples leaned closer. Conversation stopped. When she finished, the applause was sustained and genuine, not explosive, earned. Word spread quickly. Vera's performances became something people plan their evenings around. She sang with the same sincerity every time, never exaggerating, never performing beyond the truth of her voice. Audiences responded not just with applause, but with stillness, the kind that meant they felt something they hadn't expected. Each night, Vera returned to her apartment, physically tired but internally steady. The shame she had carried into the restaurant that first evening no longer had power over her. She had not argued. She had not demanded apologies. She had simply stood where she belonged. For the first time in years, Vera felt her worth acknowledged, not because of sacrifice or endurance, but because of who she was. And the door that had opened in Des Moines did not feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. Margaret Parker did not forgive failure easily. When days passed and no scandal followed the restaurant incident, her irritation curdled into something sharper. She had expected humiliation, ruin, a lesson taught quietly and efficiently. Instead, rumors reached her through social circles she trusted. Whispers of a new singer at Victor Reynolds's restaurant, of packed evenings, of a woman whose voice people described with unsettling reverence. The name reached her last. Vera Collins. Margaret's disbelief turned quickly to suspicion. A rural dairy worker did not simply transform overnight. Not without help. Not without strategy. In Margaret's mind, there was only one explanation that fit her worldview: manipulation. She began asking questions. Who was Vera to Victor? How long had they known each other? Why had he intervened so decisively? The answers were vague, unsatisfying, which only hardened Margaret's resolve. She remembered Tamara Reynolds. Victor's wife had been a fixture in the city's social circles for years. Erratic, increasingly unreliable, but still connected. Margaret knew of the drinking, knew of the volatile temperament, and she knew how to phrase things so they sounded like concern rather than accusation. She called Tamara one afternoon, her tone careful, almost reluctant. "I wasn't sure whether to say anything," Margaret began, "but I would want someone to tell me." Tamara was already drinking. The glass in her hand trembled slightly as she listened. Margaret spoke of the restaurant, of the singer, of how attentive Victor had been. She framed each sentence as a question, each implication as an accident. "It may be nothing," she said softly, "but people are talking." Tamara did not ask for proof. She did not ask for context. Her mind filled in the gaps quickly, fueled by resentment and insecurity that had been fermenting for years. By evening, Tamara was convinced. She arrived at the restaurant unannounced, unsteady on her feet, eyes glassy with alcohol and rage. The dining room was full. Vera had just finished her set and stepped off stage, still warm from the applause, still holding the quiet focus that singing gave her. Tamara spotted her immediately. The confrontation was loud, sudden, and merciless. "So this is her," Tamara slurred, pointing a shaking finger. "This is the little farm girl who thinks she can steal a man's life." The room froze. Vera did not understand at first. She stood still, stunned, as Tamara continued, her voice rising, spilling accusations without restraint. Words like mistress, gold digger, schemer echoed across the tables. "Dines tarat." Someone attempted to intervene, but Tamara shook them off. "You planned this," she shouted. "You sang your way into his pocket. You think I don't see it?" Vera tried to speak, tried to explain, but Tamara talked over her, relentless, unraveling in public. The humiliation was immediate and total. Vera felt the weight of every eye in the room, not admiring now, but uncertain, uncomfortable. She felt herself shrinking inward, the old reflex returning, the instinct to disappear, to absorb blame, quietly. Security finally intervened. Tamara was escorted out, still shouting, still cursing Vera's name. Victor arrived moments later, too late to stop the damage. Vera did not wait for explanations. She did not argue. She did not cry in front of anyone. She returned to the dressing room, changed out of the dress she had worn on stage, folded it carefully, and left it behind along with everything else Victor had bought for her. By morning, she was gone. She took the first bus back to rural Iowa. The farm welcomed her with silence, the familiar weight of routine, the smell of hay and damp earth. Vera resumed her old life as if nothing had happened, but something inside her had collapsed completely. Days passed in a blur of labor and exhaustion. Emily called, confused by the sudden distance. Vera reassured her, again choosing silence over truth. One evening after work, Vera sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, too quiet. The memories came without warning. Victor's voice, his recognition, the way he had said her name, the look in his eyes when he sang along under his breath during rehearsals. And then, deeper, older memories she had buried carefully for decades. The realization surfaced slowly, painfully, until it could no longer be ignored. Emily, the timing, the past, the truth Vera had never spoken aloud. Emily was Victor's biological daughter. Vera pressed her hands against her mouth, her breath catching. She had hidden the truth out of fear, out of pride, out of a desperate attempt to create stability where none existed. She had convinced herself it was mercy. Now it felt like a lie that had finally reached its breaking point. The collapse was complete, not just of opportunity, not just of dignity regained and lost again, but of the carefully constructed life Vera had lived, one built on sacrifice, silence, and secrets. She sat alone in the dim kitchen, the weight of decades pressing down on her, knowing that nothing could remain buried forever. Victor Reynolds did not hear the truth from gossip. He heard it from silence. When Vera failed to return his calls, when her apartment sat untouched and the restaurant staff could offer only fragments, raised voices, a confrontation, a woman escorted out, Victor understood that something had gone terribly wrong. The confirmation came when security mentioned Tamara's name. He went home that night and found his wife exactly as he expected, drinking, defensive, already rehearsing her justifications. Victor did not shout. He did not argue. He listened until she finished, until the bitterness spilled freely, until there was nothing left to disguise. Then he spoke, quietly, clearly. He told her what she had done, not just to Vera, but to him, to something fragile and honest he had rediscovered late in life. Tamara laughed at first, then raged, then cried. She threatened him with lawyers, with public embarrassment, with financial ruin. Victor did not interrupt. When she finished, he said only one thing. We're done. The divorce was neither quick nor painless. Tamara did exactly what she promised. She fought for assets, leveraged family connections, and made the process as punishing as possible. Victor lost property, saving status. He kept the restaurant, barely, and nothing else seemed to matter. What mattered was Vera. He did not call ahead. He drove west, leaving the city behind mile by mile, trading glass and traffic for open land and long roads. By the time he reached rural Iowa, the sky was already darkening. The farm looked exactly as it had years ago, unchanged, grounded. Vera opened the door before he could knock twice. She stood there silently, wearing the same practical clothes she had always worn, her hair pulled back, her expression guarded but unsurprised. It was as if some part of her had known he would come. They sat at the kitchen table. For a long moment, neither spoke. I know what happened, Victor said finally, and I'm sorry I wasn't there when it mattered. Vera nodded. She did not look at him. There's something you don't know, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Something I should have told you a long time ago. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it. She told him the truth. About the timing. About the fear. About the child she carried after they separated. About the man who raised Emily with love and never questioned her place in his life. About the lie that had grown heavier with every passing year. Victor listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room felt impossibly quiet. He stared at the table, his breath uneven. Shock came first, then grief, sharp and immediate, for the years he had missed, for the moments that could never be reclaimed. His eyes filled, but he did not wipe them away. And then beneath it all, gratitude. That she existed, he said softly. That you protected her. Vera finally looked at him. I didn't do it for the right reasons, she said. I was scared, and proud, and wrong. Victor shook his head slowly. You did what you thought would keep her safe. He reached across the table, but stopped short of touching her hand. I'm sorry, he said, for the past, for the silence, for not finding you sooner. He did not ask for anything more that night. Days later, Emily learned the truth. Vera told her herself, haltingly expecting anger, rejection, disbelief. Emily listened in silence, her face pale but composed. When the story ended, she sat very still, processing a reality she had never suspected. I had a father, Emily said at last. He loved me. Yes, Vera said. He did. That doesn't disappear, Emily continued. Not because of biology. Her voice wavered only slightly. But that doesn't mean I don't want to know the truth now. When Emily met Victor, there were no dramatic embraces. No accusations. Just cautious conversation. Then curiosity. Then recognition in small, undeniable details. Shared gestures, familiar expressions. A sense of connection that felt quiet but real. I'm not replacing anyone, Victor said. I wouldn't want to. Emily nodded. I'm not losing anyone either. The reconciliation did not erase the past. It did not fix everything, but it did something far more lasting. It made room for honesty. For the first time in decades, nothing was hidden between them. And in that truth, difficult, imperfect, and deeply human, something broken finally began to heal. The reunion between Victor and Vera did not arrive with spectacle. It unfolded quietly, first in private, shared mornings, careful conversations. The rebuilding of trust through consistency rather than promises. Victor did not try to reclaim lost time all at once. He showed up. He listened. He waited when Vera needed space and stayed when she reached for him. The past was acknowledged without being relived, and the future was approached with patience. When they returned together to Des Moines, there was no announcement. No statements. The city noticed on its own. Victor resumed his place at the restaurant with steadier purpose, and Vera returned to the stage, not as a symbol or a rumor, but as herself. Audiences welcomed her back with the same quiet attention that had first made her feel seen. This time, the applause felt different. It felt settled. Emily and Andrew finalized their wedding plans during that same season. The ceremony had always been meant to be simple, grounded, sincere, centered on commitment rather than display. As the date approached, Emily hesitated, then made a suggestion she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. "What if we do it together?" she asked one evening, half smiling. "You and Victor. Us. One day." Vera was caught off guard. "Emily, it makes sense," Emily said gently. "We're already family, and it would mean something. Not loud, just honest." Andrew agreed immediately. There was no calculation in it, no need to impress. Only a shared understanding that joy multiplied when it was not hoarded. Victor looked to Vera, not assuming, not pressing. Vera studied her daughter's face, calm, confident, unafraid, and felt something loosen inside her. "All right," she said, "if we do it quietly, on our terms." The invitation list was modest. Friends who had earned their place. People who had shown up without conditions. No spectacle. No hierarchy of importance. Margaret Parker received her invitation late. By then, the truth had reached her through channels she could not control. The failed humiliation, the public success, the divorce, the revelation of Emily's parentage. The engagement she had tried to undermine now tied irrevocably to a family whose dignity had outlasted her influence. She arrived restrained, her composure carefully assembled. The confidence she once wielded so easily was gone. She had been confronted not by retaliation, but by contrast, and it had stripped her of authority more effectively than anger ever could. When she approached Vera, it was not with excuses. "I was wrong," Margaret said, quietly enough that only they could hear. "And cruel. I used power where I had none. I'm sorry." Vera regarded her for a long moment. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "I accept it." Nothing more was required. The ceremony took place on a clear afternoon. 2 couples, 1 gathering. The vows were spoken without embellishment, each word measured and deliberate. When Emily walked forward, she did so with steady confidence. When Vera followed, there was no hesitation in her step. Victor's eyes did not leave her. They exchanged rings without commentary. Promises made plainly. Witnesses listened, not out of obligation, but recognition. This was not a story of ascent or revenge. It was a record of endurance rewarded by truth. Afterward, there was food, conversation, laughter that did not perform. Victor watched Vera speak easily with guests who had once intimidated her. Emily moved between tables with warmth. Andrew never far from her side. Margaret remained on the periphery, polite, subdued. She offered congratulations. They were accepted without ceremony. As the evening wound down, Victor and Vera stepped outside together. The noise softened behind them. The city lights reflected faintly on the pavement. "We didn't prove anything," Victor said. "Vera smiled. We didn't need to." They stood there a moment longer, comfortable in silence. Inside, Emily leaned her head against Andrew's shoulder. She watched her mother across the room, no longer braced, no longer diminished. "It wasn't money," Emily said softly. "It was never money." Andrew nodded. "It never is." The night ended without a final speech. No declarations, no reckoning, just people leaving with the sense that something had resolved itself properly. In the weeks that followed, life continued. Work, shared meals, familiar routines. The cruelty that had once sought to define the family faded into irrelevance, undone not by force, but by exposure. Dignity, it turned out, did not require defense. It endured, and love, when finally spoken without fear, proved it had never belonged to any class at all.